Hey, good morning, everyone. Welcome to a 9 a.m. meeting versus a 7 a.m. for people in the Pacific Coast, that is. Marina, you might be the chair today. I don't see Steve on the call.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
I can take notes today.
All right, thanks. Yeah, and then I'll post a link to the right here. And wants to sign in. Right, it looks like the only thing on the agenda is some open issues, which I think Pritesh has both of. So I can go ahead and hand it over to you.
And if you're speaking Pritesh, you're on mute.
Let me see if I can ping Pritesh on the side.
Yeah, I see him in the call, but not sure if he's having issues connecting or something.
Yeah, we still can't hear you, Pritesh.
I'm audible now.
Yep, we can hear you now, though you're
Yay. A little quiet.
Okay, is it better?
Yep, that's good.
Yeah, so I think I only have two agenda items. One is the trust scope document. I missed the last meeting because I overslept. So there were a couple of feedbacks on that PR. I have replied to most of them. Is there any other major outstanding concerns on the PR? Let me share the stream also, and I could post the PR link in the chat also. Here's the first one, and let me share the screen. So this was basically about adding the scope for the trust policy.
think we also had some notes on this from last meeting, and it looked like Pritesh, you had put some feedback in
Yeah.
the HackMD. Do we want to go over those today?
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah.
Yeah, on the first one, I think the comment was that any order didn't really matter. So even like longest match or something like that, it doesn't matter if you match the first one or the third one or whatever, whichever match you end up matching is, as long as you match one of them, it would be considered a pass. And so the ordering only matters if you want to say that we matched the longest one, or we didn't match the longest one, so we're not even going to try the shorter ones. That would be the only reason you would want to do that. And so I wanted to clarify if that's actually important or not. I think for at least some use cases I'm used to, people don't care which entry they match against.
Yeah, for longest prefix, the order won't matter. But if we were planning to go with wildcard in earlier discussion, then the order would have mattered.
I guess my maybe like possible concern would be that maybe if would the order affect whether or not like it was accepted? Like if one person checked one policy, another person checked another policy, would they come up with different answers for whether or not to use it? And is that a problem? Because that might be confusing for the user or some such.
So in longest prefix, the order won't matter irrespective of the order won't matter whether the policy comes in the JSON array. It's just that the one having the longest prefix match will be picked by validating the signature.
Yeah, I think we're still saying two different things. Because you're saying you want to find the longest prefix to use that one policy. And if it matches, you get approved. If it doesn't match, you get denied. The way I'm saying it is, doesn't matter. Match any of them. And if any of the policies happen to match, then it's approved. And that way you could create a global policy that says, here is a global generic policy that matches anything, but only with a certain key. And if anybody happens to sign with that key, then you trust it. So it's kind of a different way of looking at the problem. And I'm not sure which one makes the most sense for us, but I know use case wise, a lot of people I've worked with kind of expect that scenario of saying, okay, I just want to put in a generic key that I'm going to sign stuff with that would match anything. And they want to have that. And they don't want to have something that's a longer policy override that rule that they put in there.
So that should also work with longest prefix, right? If you have anything, example is, I think I had it somewhere here. This is basically without any, if you don't specify any scope, it will be like, it will consider as a global scope. So you don't have to put any scope, it will work with that. And if you specify an repository with a scope, then it will match use this one for evaluation.
Yeah, but I guess where I'm going is if I had that scope of the WABIT, whatever, and I had a key or a signature on that came from the long list TS from your catch-all policy, would that pass?
No.
And that's the problem.
Because for this registry, I don't trust that long TS, long list TS.
So you may not. Other clients I've worked with do.
Yeah. So they would have to specify this as a part of the, and then it will work.
And that's a user experience that I think some people consider tedious because they have to go through each one of their trust policies and add every one of the keys they want to get signed on it.
If they don't want to, then don't add scope and add everything to this and it will work.
I think I get where you're coming from, Brandon, but it's also, I think that if you have the one universal one that can overwrite the more specific ones, it's like a pretty big single point of failure, right? If that one key is compromised.
Indeed.
Versus if you have the more specific ones that are like only used for those particular cases.
It is, but that's an issue for any time you make a global policy because you could just have a typo in there. And instead of saying wabbitnetworks.io, you'd say wabbitnetworks.com and suddenly you're hitting the global policy there.
Well, security is a little bit different in that if there is enough value concentrated in one key, that gives someone perhaps a motivation to put a lot of effort into breaking that key.
Yeah, the places I've worked with that tend to make a global key like that, it's for a small organization. And so it's your pro con there is who's going to spend the effort to break a key for a small organization of a couple hundred people versus
I think I actually
break the one key for
downside
one
is-
repo.
But
Yeah,
they
the
can-
downside is if we make it like so that everyone who's using this policy, you know, you can just pick any of the keys, that it's just the same security property for anyone. What I would say is for these smaller organizations, they should probably just not make the longer matches, right? They should just do their one key and use it unless they need something more specific for some reason.
Yeah, for like small organization, this will just suffice. They don't need to add this policy. They don't need to use any scope, and they can just add the list here of the keys they trust. If they don't add any scope, then we always use the default and just global scope.
Yeah, it's tedious. It won't make me happy, but at least I threw the scenario out there. So
Yeah.
I'll go ahead and say I've said my piece.
We can play out the scenario a little bit more, maybe see what it would look like in different cases.
Yeah. So I do have that this public and private repository where like I have multiple scenarios listed here, which is like different public and like if a organization is consuming from public and private repository, how it will look like. Then the organization is consuming for multiple regions in registries, for example, Amazon ECR, they have like different URI for different region because they have region and the account in the name, how it will look like. Then we have pre-prod and prod scenario where an organization has different pre-prod and prod environment, pre-prod for testing and prod for serving prod traffic, how it will look like. Then I added one more scenario of like where in a big organization, you have like an org policy and a team specific policy because org can provide some common framework which is used by all the teams inside that company. So that then there's the example for that one where they trust both. Then I added one more example for whether one team in an organization is using multiple repositories, how will they add trust for that? And specifically, they are using different keys for different products which they vend. So I have a scenario for that also, and there's like catch-all with that. Is there any scenario we are missing apart from this? There is one scenario which I can think of was while when we launch it and how they are going to slowly ramp up, basically how they're slowly going to start signing and they reached a point where apart from allow list, where so right now scoping only works on allow list, but at certain point they have to move from allow list to deny list. For example, if most of the content are signed, but some of the content is not signed, the scoping really doesn't help here. But I will publish a second PR for adding a denial list kind of thing.
Yeah, there's definitely a challenge of the onboarding process here. I was going to throw it. I think that was another one of the comments that was over in the HackMD last time, which is that some clients I've worked with are looking at how can they put a different key on a different type of object in the same repository. And so the scope wouldn't be granular enough for them. And so what they're looking at is how can we put trust in the SBOM from one signer versus trust in the image from a different signer and have different keys for those different roles.
So Brendan, this is Samir, sorry, jump in. My thought on that one after the meeting was that when there are different objects being coming from the same scope, and they could be using different keys, but when they're being pulled, it's unlikely they'll be pulled for the same reason. For example, when you're pulling in container images to run in your Kubernetes, at that point, you're probably not interested in checking these SBOM. This is me speculating. I'm not a containers expert, but what I was thinking is the SBOM checking will probably happen in a different workflow, and the container image signature verification will happen in a different workflow. And those two scenarios don't have to be done at the same time in the same trust policy.
Definitely a possibility.
But like
And
SBOM should,
that would be an option to solve it. Sorry, Pritesh, go ahead.
yeah, SBOM should be usually done. Evaluation of SBOM should be usually done at build time, not at deploy time. Because if you do it deploy time and there's a vulnerability found there, then you're scaling. Then auto scaling won't work in that scenario, which might not be the good user experience. That if they want to scale, and this the scaling of new pods is failing because signature verification is failing for some reason.
Yeah, so it depends on what the SBOM is. This goes back to some of the other, like the supply chain working group was just talking about this a minute ago, where you might want to have attestations of a vulnerability scan being finished recently. And so the Kubernetes image controller might say, hey, I want to make sure this was signed by a trusted entity and that our scanner ran across it. And the trusted entity shouldn't be the one that's given us the signature from our scanner. Our scanner's trusted by, internally. It's different groups. So they're looking for different keys for those different tasks.
In that scenario, won't they be signing actual image, not SBOM? With some
The end result would be I don't know if they're going to sign the image or if they're going to sign an attestation on the image. It could be different things.
Mhm.
I'll just throw out that this is some of the kinds of relationships that tough metadata and delegations have actually kind of been designed to solve, really, so that you can have and relationships between delegations where you need someone from this delegation tree and someone from this delegation tree, so that you have both of those sets of attestations before you actually install the image.
I think the difference in Milind here, in Tufts case would be, at least it currently, I think it supports only a chain through a single route, right? Whereas here you could have different certificates or roles derived from different roles, different routes, signing different artifacts. That's the only difference I can see.
Yeah, and that's I think one of the things we've been working on with Tough for this project specifically, right? Is separating the root of trust from the registry because people want to set their own. Yeah.
I just wanted to add on to Brandon's point that if you have different type of artifacts being signed by in the same scope, being signed by different entities, we can probably support that. We can probably extend this to say media type or artifact type. But I think we can, my feel is that we have already made this quite rich enough to support like the 80% case. And if there is more concrete scenarios, we can, as long as we can extend into it. I think some of the complexities here compared to policies in other, I don't know, other ecosystems or for other artifacts is you have same artifact having multiple signatures. That is one dimension. And you have multiple artifacts being consumed in the same environment. You have multiple images being used for the same application, and we are also supporting related artifacts. So to get a policy which makes it like handles all kind of scenarios would make it quite complicated. Like we're trying to balance like the user experience and kind of being able to understand or rationalize the policy versus adding all the different aspects.
Yeah, that's more than a fair point. Well taken there. And I would say a lot of my feedback here, I just want to make sure that it's something worth thinking about, not necessarily something that you feel like it's necessary to implement on Alpha 1, version 1, whatever we're pushing out next.
Yeah, and I think the scopes, I think it was excellent feedback from you for the scopes that really makes it usable in real world with where you're migrating or where you're using a mix of public, private. I guess as long as we can talk about those additional scenarios and say how we can possibly extend it, there's a path to extend, I think that should be good. I feel we can support your scenario.
Yeah,
if we need.
but if a different artifact type user, if we really want to support it, they can have a different trust policy, because notation will be called independently for that artifact, or a CLI would call that independently, so they can put a different policy depending upon
You
the.
can do it using different policies too. Yes.
Yeah. Like they can have completely different policy for as bounds, and they can just pass that policy instead of passing the image policy.
Hey, just sorry, jump in. Just one quick feedback. Just looking at it, going back to my software development days, is it possible to add comments in a trust policy, like so that it makes it more, or is it like just add a comment in the trust policy itself?
If it's a basic JSON, your JSON parser supports just comments, then it will work. Otherwise, it won't. It depends upon implementation. The JSON parser.
That's an
JSON
excellent
itself
point.
doesn't.
Yeah.
So
Could you switch to YAML?
Oh, YAML set of problems. It's like there is no way to know if over the wire a part of YAML is dropped, we won't even come to know. There's a problem with YAML.
there's JSON C, right? I don't know how formalized it is. JSON with comments. I saw VS Code support it. We didn't touch upon this topic, but my plan was at least that all of these policies should support JSON C, and you can put inline comments in the policy, which would be super useful. Does anybody have any background or any comments on JSON C? I haven't used it. I've seen it in a few examples in a couple of places. Cool. I guess as long as we are able to have a JSON C parser, we can support it.
Yeah, I think it depends upon JSON. I don't think JSON RFC says anything about comments, but I might be wrong.
You're right. It's the standard JSON does not include comments.
Okay, then the names will be descriptive enough to probably make up for that. Yep, sounds good. Sorry to distract the team.
And a common workaround is to have special field names like description that are basically comments.
Yeah, that would work too.
Yeah. And that would be an optional field, so we can always add that in the future if required. There were a couple of more comments on PR. I think this was the one I was really interested in. It was by Jason. It's Jason. So the idea here was we will use longest prefix match irrespective whether it's a namespace or a registry or a partial namespace. Do we really want to just restrict it to a complete namespace match or a registry server name match or something like that? Because my idea was that the scope is not a security feature, it just scopes down the trust the trust root, which are basically the keys which secures it. Scope just narrows it down which one to use.
I disagree. I definitely think the scope is part of the security of it, because yeah, what different people are allowed to sign is definitely an important piece of trusting those keys.
Yeah, but even if I provide a functionality where the scope, for example, software and software as a SDF bad guy matches, unless my key is compromised, there's no harm to the system.
Well, it depends on what exactly you're trusted to sign and whether you can say overwrite some other some other file and add a signature to that that you're not supposed to be allowed to sign.
Yeah, but to add a signature, the key has to be compromised.
Or you just have to have a malicious maintainer or something, yeah.
And even if the maintainer, they created a namespace like software is a bad guy, then even I only trust my key for that, then that key has to be compromised, or someone else's key has to be compromised. But if I by default trust this domain for that key, then I'm already trusting that software to do the right thing.
I think what we mean by, again, this is debatable. Me and Pritesh talked a bit about this, and we feel the scope in itself is, what we mean by scope in itself is not a security control, is the trust is derived by the verifying the signature and not where it came from. In the policy evaluation, the scope is just a way to select which trusted routes and which policy you want to apply. So if there is misconfiguration, so we are saying we other than the initial step of here's the artifact that you want notation to verify, and here's its registry URL. So you go in the policy, if there is a scope, matches that scope, you select that particular policy. That is the only role of the scope. There's no other security value or guarantee associated with it. Under that path, you could have unsigned images signed by somebody else, malicious images. It's the job of the rest of the trust policy, your configured trusted routes, etc., to be able to correctly validate and pick only trusted images. So even if somebody ended up, because all of this is, you could pick from a particular scope, you could pick from a completely different registry, and the intent is in the end, you're only relying on the signing key for.
Okay, so wait, so do you get the identity of the signing key from somewhere different than this then?
You get the identity of the signing key from the signature itself. The signature will have some metadata, and then you match that up with the policy.
But could that metadata be changed by an attacker or something though? If they were trying to add a malicious signature?
Yep, they can.
What do you mean by, I didn't get that. Some of those are signed attributes.
So if it's basically in attacker controlled metadata, right? If an attacker is trying to upload a malicious signature and they can control any information in that signature, you need to make sure that you can validate what the public key you're supposed to use is from an external trusted source, right? So you have to have a secure way of obtaining the identity that you're trusting.
Yep. So the signature manifest will contain, I think we have unsigned X509 certificate chain in the signature blob. Also, some of that will be surfaced in the signature manifest itself. So that is one piece where certificate or chain information comes from. The trusted configuration is your trust policy, where you specify what are the trusted routes. And then you match, there's another piece remaining on how do you match these things, because there are multiple signatures to deal with. You match them up. You could have a signature where the metadata is forged or doesn't match the actual signature. In that case, finally, the signature verification will fail. But you're relying on the root or anchors defined in your trust policy to drive this process. And the scope is a way of selecting a particular policy. I think Brandon had his hand raised in between.
Oh yeah, I can't see that from the screen. Go ahead, Brandon.
Nah, I put it back down again.
Did the UI change? I don't see that top list of folks. And then
I think when it's in presentation mode, I guess I could pull it up, but I think it's harder to see the hand raises. So sorry if I've missed that.
So to summarize, we do have a list of, for example, in the certificates, we do have a list of certificates in the signature, which is unsigned metadata, and user decides, and in trust, user might specify the intermediate certificate or root certificate that has to match with this. And we also verify that the chain we are forming here is correct chain, which leads to a trusted root specified in the trust store.
I'll look over this again and double check. I think I still have a general concern that that if an attacker is able to control this information, they'd be able to manipulate it in a way that they could affect the signature, but I'd want to look more carefully. So I don't want to waste time here doing that.
Yeah, that was the only thing which I was worried about was this comment. And like, yeah, apart from that, yep, we are replying to Brandon's comment. We won't support any reference expression or anything like that. Every URI will be completely resolved. There has to be explicit.
I think to summarize that again, we are saying the scope is just a string prefix match without any other semantic meaning associated with it. So it is not path or any other registry URL format aware. And we don't think that presents an issue with respect to security. And that's what we are saying. So if anybody thinks otherwise, we can discuss.
Yeah, I think any other comments on this PR? Otherwise, we can move to next one.
Yeah, I raised my hand on that one. I think
Sorry.
the comment there was we have decided to investigate for the future if the longest prefix shall support wildcards in between the DNS dots, if you will. So first of all, we fully understand that longest prefix and wildcard are two separate things in this proposal. Either we go down the longest prefix route or either we go down the wildcard route. I think last time, and I think even today's discussion, we are going down the longest prefix route. But I think towards the end of last meeting, Justin proposed that even in longest prefix can we use wildcards which are limited to a scope within, say, 2 backslashes or between 2 dots. And I'm probably not saying it right. Justin would have done a much better job explaining his point. He says, let's just park it for a future point. This is good to go right now, but in future we can evaluate if wildcards have to be supported along with longest prefix.
Yeah, we could. The issue is at least it seems like the moment you introduce wildcards, it reduces the being able to rationalize the policy. You may have priorities come in while multiple scopes conflict with wildcards. So I think, yeah, I agree. The V1 should just go with the scopes that seems to address most of the scenarios, and we can evolve this later.
Also, add more comment, if we are supporting wildcard, we don't really need longest prefix, then we can just rely on wildcard. We can just add wildcard at the end of the URL to support the longest prefix by that.
Okay, yep, we can park it for future. Yep, this is good to go for right now then.
Moving on to next PR. So in this PR, basically I have had the verification and the signing workflows, how to look like with Notary. What are the steps? If someone is implementing this, what are the steps they need to do to verify it correctly? Also, I added some minimum requirements for the certificate, so we don't support like Chauvin and things like that in certificates. Also, yeah, these are the basic. This is basic verification and signing workflow. What the steps user needs to take to sign and verify the artifact. And then I also added a detailed verification steps, like how timestamp should be evaluated, how certificate expiry should be evaluated, how certificate revocation using CRL or OCSP, and what are the minimum kinds of CRLs we need to support and things like that. For example, we will support, like the implementation support both base and delta CRL, not the indirect CRLs for certificate check, certificate revocation checks and things like that.
I haven't had a chance to read up on the latest PR. Did we talk about, I'll just do a quick one and tell me if it's just dropped into where, did we talk about using timestamps to validate historic as opposed to extending forward? What I mean by that is if you use the SolarWinds example, instead of revoking the key for everything it's signed in eternity, that you can say that we think the exploit happened on March 10th. So we're going to actually revoke based on from March 1st forward. So anything that was signed up to March 1st is still valid.
So
But things,
we did look into it. So there is something called invalidity date in CRLs and OCSP. It's an extra extension there, but most of the public CA doesn't publish this invalidity. But if you have a private CA, then yes, it might work for you. But there's a provision called invalidity date, which is basically the date from which certificate is considered revoked. But it's an optional extension inside the CRL and OCSP. So it depends upon the entity who is publishing the CRL or OCSP to provide the value for us. If there is a value for invalidity date, then we use that to calculate whether the certificate was revoked on, certificate is considered revoked or not. If the invalidity date extension is not present, then we consider certificate as revoked by default.
okay, I think some of this might trigger into the way PKIs are handled today versus what we'd like to shift going forward. So for instance, I'm proposing we don't revoke signing keys unless the identity is actually stolen. Like you don't revoke a key you don't revoke something that's signed because it was signed by somebody and it's unless the identity was stolen. So if somebody steals an identity, then we should revoke because those weren't actually valid signatures. Just because something's corrupt or has a vulnerability into it, you should not revoke the identity. There should be another piece of information that says this thing is bad for X reasons. So that might be all coupled up into that phase 2 shift of how we think about revocations of identities versus vulnerabilities in an artifact. So
You're differentiating the revoking a key versus revoking a signature.
Yeah, and you revoke it. You would only revoke a key because the identity was compromised. You don't revoke my proposal. This is in that latest paper that I wrote was you only revoke because identity is stolen or I forget the other term I used, but basically it's because somebody doesn't other than in nice futuristic movies. Somebody doesn't take Brandon's DNA and become another Brandon. They've stolen his ability to represent Brandon and they're acting on inappropriately acting on his behalf. So that's the part where we want to revoke a signing key. So I think the main piece is if there's TSA in the information, then we have the ability to do this new concept going forward, even though the current PKI infrastructure doesn't support it.
I mean, if someone wants to clone my identity, I would be very interested in that because I could use an extra set of hands here. But going back to the comment, I would say, are we still including the option to revoke a signature on something that was maliciously signed? Thinking back to something like the SolarWinds, where you find out someone got into the build server and did something bad, but they didn't actually have the signing key. They just were able to sign some very malicious code going out. Are we keeping that as an option, or are we saying that, no, we're not going to do that because we're not going to revoke the key because the key is still trusted, and we're not going to revoke the individual signature because that's not even an option, or is it an option is where I'm going.
I think, did you get a chance to read the paper? I know it winds up being long.
I did not.
So take a look at that, because the answer is yes, we do want to have a way to state an opinion around some software that got shipped. The identity of who created it is part of the input. So the scenario that we've been talking about, yes, I think the technical way we do it, my position needs to shift a little bit. And the example that I use in there is the one we always, well, the particular example is an example of what we always talk about. Just because somebody says something's not good doesn't mean I shouldn't be able to continue to use it for some period of time. Right? It's an opinion that, yep, that is definitely a problem. Turns out it's not really a problem for me right now because I put up all my code operates in a VNet. I can't send information anywhere. So it's super important, but I'm going to continue shipping the rocket and I'm going to deal with that 3 days later. Like I can't have my system stop running at that moment because a critical vulnerability was out, but I'm not actually impacted by it. So there's examples of router networks firing a rocket, and there's examples of asbestos in there that come to that. So anyway, yes, we want to solve it. I'm just not sure this is the right infrastructure for it.
Like we will have to support revocation. So I think what we are suggesting is basically recommendations and best practices for revocation. Yeah, so this.
Well, Brandon's asking a different question. The idea that you can revoke a signing key, yes. What's happened is the historic model is you revoke the signing key because you think there's a vulnerability in it. That I'm saying is those are two separate pieces of information. You shouldn't use one for the other. We do need to be able to revoke because identities do get compromised. That's the words I was looking for. But that happens far less often than there's software exploits. So I'm just saying we should separate revoking identity for what somebody represents versus how we handle software exploits.
Yeah, and I definitely appreciate there's going to be another farther line that people are going to try to cross, though, which would be, hey, the software, there was a vulnerability discovered in it later on that was just log4j or something like that.
Yeah.
That everything's got that. And we don't want to go out there and retroactively revoke everything that's got log4j in it.
Exactly.
But if there is an actual known malicious build where we sign something we didn't intend to sign for whatever reason, are we saying that that's not an option to revoke a signature in a signed content?
So I think
you're saying revoke a signature as opposed to revoke the signing key.
Yeah, not the key itself, but just an individual signature of some data and saying, you know what, we signed that before. We did do that. We still own the key. We just don't trust that one thing we signed anymore. It was a bad signature. I
think, yes, we need to solve that. I don't have a perfect answer on how yet.
Okay.
Would involve adding a lot of complexity to signatures since they currently are not individually identifiable.
Correct.
The signatures aren't, but the thing they signed is.
Right. Think of the way security scanners work today. So I'm hoping this will shift more to a security scanning time shift solution as opposed to a factual upfront piece of data that is used to solve the time shift problem. In the article I talk about, asbestos was a best practice that you required to be in your theaters when you built them. Now that same exact material, that same exact artifact is viewed as, I will not allow that in my environment. So having things as SBOMs, having information around what went in versus an informed decision over time are separate categories. Sorry, I didn't mean to throw this off too much.
I don't know if this is helpful, but something that we're doing in the Persia project, or at least thinking about, is being able to add additional metadata to artifacts, either to attest that it is good or attest that it is bad.
And the question is, who decides that? So in the SolarWinds case, they eventually figured it out themselves. So they could update their own metadata, to your point, Mark. But if a company is gone, or a company doesn't believe they're doing something wrong, but the industry decides it is bad, you need a way for an external entity to state an opinion around a certain piece of software.
We're going to have a very non-trivial trust model to evaluate that, but it's going to be one of our serious undertakings.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah. So this PR talks about like artifact revocation or a particular signature revocation. It only talks about certificate revocation, at least in revocation perspective, this PR.
I want to make a few comments on the conversation that we had. On revocation itself, we can put this on agenda for next week. The last time we had conversation around revocation when there was a draft around how to support revocation, we didn't bottom out on that. I think some of my opinion is that we should support some basic revocation, CRL, OCSP based but I didn't hear from, I don't know if we have gotten past that decision, Steve, Brandon, and others. I strongly feel basic CRL OCSP support should be there. They are useful in certain specific scenarios, like a publisher, large publisher vendor publishing images to through any public repository widely consumed or organization scenario. But beyond that, I think you should like also understand the limits of it, that existing CRL OCSP mechanisms and infrastructure are not super reliable. So that you usually don't hard fail on them in production, but you can definitely use them during build and any other kind of validation. And on the signature, we also discussed about signature level revocation or artifact revocation earlier. The biggest stumbling block there is there's no existing standard way to do it, and anything that you build, somebody will have to host some infrastructure, and that won't be CAs. So we'll have to define what that infrastructure looks like, and even if it is practical for anybody interested in to do that. And even with that, like SolarWinds or Log4j, all of those scenarios, it's important to recognize that, at least as far as I know, currently signature validation will only be done at when you consume an image to build something, post you build image, you send it to somebody else, they can validate it, or during deployment through Gatekeeper, etc. But once it is running in an environment, there's no controls there to say these are all the environments where things are, where something vulnerable is running and it should stop, etc. Go ahead, Brandon.
Yeah, I want to be careful not to say that nobody has solved this for signing, revoking a signature in something, because we've got Marina on the call here. Tough does that today, where you can just pull it out of the snapshot and then it's no longer trusted. So there are solutions to it. It's a question of, do we want to add that level of complexity and overhead to solve that problem here? And so I think that needs to be a discussion we're having, not whether or not somebody has even done it. So nobody's done it, so we can't even think about it.
Sure, but yeah, I agree with what you said. What I meant was, it's either registry level metadata or some metadata. Yeah, there's still things to be solved there.
It just goes back to roles and responsibilities. Do we have the information that somebody can make that kind of decision? And it's, look, people are going to use different different pieces of data, different tools for different jobs. I'm sure things will be abused outside of the scope, and I'm sure there'll be new innovative ideas that come out. I think at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is make sure that there is an identity associated with something. That's like the root of what we're saying. There's an existing X509 infrastructure that users and customers are comfortable with its pros and flaws. And we are saying that we are moving the system forward. For instance, to your point around where the revocation is initiated from, I'm hoping identity revocations will focus on identity revocations for signatures, and we'll focus on artifact revocations in a different way. So there will be less of a burden on the existing infrastructure for that, and new technologies evolve for how we solve the individual artifact revocations. And again, and to your point, once it's in a production environment, it's up to the user to decide whether they want it revoked automatically as well. Like anybody can write a containerd plugin that blocks if a signature is considered valid, or if they find something in SPUB that's invalid. I'm not sure it's the best choice. So that was the point of the paper, was to try to get that thought process out there for people to start thinking about. So yes, what you're saying in this doc, I think, is a good start.
Yeah, that's all I had. Anything else in agenda items?
So it's great to see these as PRs, so we can start churning on them and see what we can do about getting them merged. If there's nothing else, I can use the time to upload and not be late in how I upload videos.
So,
Actually, Marina, you were chair. I will defer to you.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think that's everything that was on the agenda. I was kind of like, Pritesh do the day because if he had all the agenda, but yeah, if that's it, thanks everyone and see everyone next week.